Okay, it's quite an honor for me to join a group of very distinguished speakers and to give some presentation in this prestigious place. And in this afternoon, I'd like to have a rethinking of economic development, and I provide a framework I call new structural economics. And I have 4 topics I'd like to discuss with you. The first one is that why we need to have a rethinking of economic development. And certainly the reason it matters. And the second one I'd like to discuss with you is that what has the economic theory and practice evolved since the Second World War. And the third one is that a framework I call new structural economics. And the reason I want to introduce a new framework, certainly, I want to improve our understanding of the process of economic development and make a contribution to the real world. And then I want to introduce a new approach for the government to make a contribution to the sustainable inclusive growth in our country, both in low-income country, middle-income country, hopefully also in high-income country. And for that, I call the approach growth identification and facilitation. Well, we know that we are in economic crisis. And since end of 2008 to now, I think in many forums, I'm sure also in your forum, you have some kind of rethinking of our theory, of our approach to economy, to international affairs. And the reason why there's so intensity in the rethinking is because for any kind of theory, its purpose is to help us to understand the phenomena. Economic theories, its function is to help us understand economic phenomena, on the one hand. On the other hand, hope. This kind of understanding can help us to make a better economic choice and in order to make a contribution to the betterment of our well-being of our societies. And with this kind of objective in mind, if the economic theory fails to explain the observed phenomena, or the policy based on the theory cannot help us to improve our economic life under the kind of contradictions, then people will have rethinking of the theory. And obviously, the reason why now there are so many discussions of rethinking of economic theory is because of the global crisis, was not anticipated by the economic theory. And even the way out of this crisis is not facilitated by the existing economic theory. And if we use this as a criterion, I'd like to say the development economics, since it was started to become an independent economic discipline after the Second World War, it has been constantly in the process of rethinking. Because in the post-war period, we know at that time, the development thinking was dominated by a group of economists, call them the structuralists. And their theory was the structuralism. And at that time, their recommendation was that, well, the reason why some country, the income were lower than the high-income country, because they did not have the same economic structure or same industry as a high-income country. And then they say the reason why the low-income country did not have this kind of capital-intensive industry and so on, was because of market failures. And so you need to use the government intervention to overcome the market failures in order for the low-income country to develop similar industry as in a high-income country, and to compete with a high-income country, to enjoy the same income level as in a high-income country. And those kind of policy was packaged in a way called import substitution strategies and use government intervention to develop the modern heavy industry at that time. We know the result was the miserable. Many countries, or almost all the developing countries, no matter they were in the socialist camp or they are in the capitalist camp, they all follow a similar approach, but they all failed. And then because of that, by the time of 1980s, there was a rethinking to say, well, yes, you observe market failures, but government failures were more serious than the market failures. And so the way to develop the economy was to liberalize your economy, reduce the government intervention, and in a package called Washington Consensus. Certainly, the socialist group in many developing countries follow those kind of Washington Consensus recommendation. But I'd like to say, the result was at most mixed. In effect, certainly during the period of time, some countries adopt other approach than Washington Consensus, but they perform better. And those countries follow the Washington Consensus, they did not achieve their intended goal. And certainly, from the 1950s to now, there were some countries where economies, although the number was very small, they performed very well. And the notable cases, experiences, was in the East Asian economy, like Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong. Since the 1950s, they enjoy a very sustained period of time and change their status from low income to middle income, now even high income economies. And their economic approach was export-oriented instead of import substitution. And then from the 1980s, you also have some transitional economy, like China, like Vietnam, or in European countries like Slovenia. They perform much better, but they did not adopt Washington Consensus. And these two groups of countries, they're all market-based, but the government play a very proactive role in the process of development or in the process of transition. So that means what? Currently, the theory in development, the transition, cannot explain the economic phenomenon, and it cannot guide us to achieve our intended goal. And with this kind of contradiction, certainly, we need to have a rethinking of our tool, our economic theory. Okay. And I'd like to say, World Bank is a Bretton Woods institution. Certainly, people say World Bank follow Washington Consensus or promoting Washington Consensus. But I also like to say, World Bank, because the need to deal with the real life. So the World Bank has also been in the process of rethinking since the 1990s. And the first one was the publication of East Asian Miracles in 1993. And in that publication, World Bank recognized the reason for the East Asian economies to be much more successful was because of they adopt export orientation strategies and they have a government intervention, but government was market friendly. And then in 2004, the World Bank also published another publication called The Lessons of the 1990s. In this publication, World Bank recognized there was no one-size-fits-all. So the Washington Consensus was not sufficient because Washington Consensus certainly proposed certain desirable policies, but they only had one size and asked other countries to fit that size. And from the study show, this approach was not appropriate. And then in 2008, there was a publication called the Growth Commission Report. And this commission was headed by Michael Spence. He is a Nobel laureate. And based on their studies of the experiences since the Second World War, they identified 13 economies enjoyed 7% and more annual growth rate continuously for 25 years. And the status effects of this 13 economy were in 5 dimensions. The first one, they are all open economy. The second one, they have macro stability. The third one, they have high rate of savings and investment. And the first one, they all rely on market mechanism for resource allocation. And the last one, they all have committed, capable, proactive government. Okay, so that is in a process of reconsideration, rethinking. And today, my job is to propose a framework, because those publications just list the status effects and what are the causes, what are the consequences, cannot be understood from just status effects. We need to have a theoretical framework to tie them together and to know what are the causes, what are the consequences. And a new theory I'd like to propose called the new structural economics. And the implication is that to apply the neoclassical approach to understand the determination of economic structure as well as the underlying forces for the structural changes. And I explain, structural changes actually is the nature of economic development. And this approach will tie all the status effects together. And to understand what are the causes, what are the consequences. And for any country, the purpose certainly is to achieve sustainable and economic growth. So to reduce poverty and to increase the income. That's the goal of economic development. And I'd like to say, this kind of phenomenon, sustainable increase in per capita income, is a recent phenomenon. Because before the 18th century, actually, the income growth in the world, no matter in which part of the world, was extremely low. And according to an estimation by a famous historian, Angus Madison, before 18th century, the annual growth rate of per capita income in the western part of Europe, now the high-income country, was only 0.05% per year. That means what? It took 1,400 years to double per capita income. But after the 18th century, the income started to accelerate, and especially in the Western European countries, as well as North America. And this kind of acceleration is a result of continuous change in economic structure, because before 18th century, no matter in which part of the world, most of the economic employment was in agricultural sectors. And industry service was only a very small portion of the economy. And the acceleration of the income actually reflects the out-migration of labor force from agriculture to manufacturing sector to service sectors. And for the country now achieve high income, the employment in agriculture in general is less than 5%. And I bet it is also the situation in Ireland now. And then, it shift to manufacturing sectors, it shift to service sectors. But if you look into the country which currently they are still in the low income stages, 70%, 80% of their population is still in the traditional agricultural sectors. So if we want to understand economic development, if we want to understand the increase and especially sustainable increase in income, we need to understand what determines the economic structure and what drives the economic structural changes. And it's a good example is that, because many people forget this. They only see the US today, one of the most powerful country, highest income country. They only see they have the computers, they have the robot, they have the airplane. And they have the Wall Street, and they have research center like MIT or Harvard education centers. But in effect, in the 17th century, the economic structure in the US was similar to African countries today, because the majority, 80–90% of the population was in agriculture, so they had a Thanksgiving, and it's coming in a few days. And then, in the 19th century, to the early 20th century, the economic structure was in textile, and in something like the production of rubber shoot. And that was very similar to low-income countries today. Well, and then the framework I'd like to propose was that my starting point of this kind of analysis for economic development and structural changes is starting from understanding of the importance of economic endowment. For economists, we often say endowment consists of the total amount of natural resources you have, the total amount of labor force you have, the total amount of capitals, both human capital and physical capital, that our economy has. And this is very important for economic analysis, because economic endowments, it's the total budget that economy has at any given time. Total amount of capital, total amount of natural resources, total amount of labor force are the economy's total budget. And certainly, countries have different amount of capital, natural resource, and labor force. So they have a structure. Some are more abundant in capital, some are more abundant in natural resources or labor force. Because this kind of relative abundance, then you have different relative price in capital, in natural resources, and in labor force. So economic endowment and its structure actually determine the economy's total budget as well as the economy's relative prices. Well, for anyone who ever takes Econ 101, you know that total budget and the relative prices are two most important economic parameters in economic analysis. And endowment and its structure already consist of these two most fundamental parameters in analysis. And it's also important in a sense for economic growth, because economic endowment is given at any specific time, but it's changeable over time. And so for us to understand economic development, we not only want to understand what is your choice now, we also want to understand what your choice in the future and how it's evolved. And economic endowment could achieve that goal. So that's the first thing. Then I'd like to say, the relative amount of endowment and its relative price will determine what your competitive advantages in the production. If you are abundant in labor force, you will be competitive in labor-intensive type of production. And vice versa, if you are relatively abundant in capitals, then you will be competitive in capital-intensive type of production. So that means that endowment structure determines your competitiveness because it determines your competitive advantages. And that means that because at any given time, your endowment and its structure is given, so that means that at any given time, you have an optimal industrial structure. Certainly for the economic development is that you want to achieve higher income. If you want to achieve higher income, certainly you need to have industrial structure similar to the high-income country. That is more capital intensive, both in human capital and physical capitals. But because of industrial structure is endogenous to your endowment structure, under that kind of situation, if you want to move your income, you need to move your industrial structure. But if you want to move your industrial structure, you need to upgrade your endowment structure to make each worker to possess more capital per workers. But how to do that? To do that is that in each stage of development, you need to develop your industries according to your competitive advantages. If you are abundant in labor, then you develop a labor-intensive industry. Or if you are abundant in capital, you develop capital-intensive industry. And this kind of economic structure will make you to be most competitive. So you can have the largest possible market. And it can also have the highest possible profit or economic surplus. With that, you can save more, then your capital can accumulate fast, your endowment structure will upgrade more quickly, and your industry will upgrade quickly, your income can increase quickly. So from this analysis, you will draw a conclusion. To follow your competitive advantages is the best way to develop your economy. But here is that competitive advantage is a term, abstract, can only be understood by economists. But for the people in the market, for those entrepreneurs, they only care about profit. And how can you have an incentive structure to make them, in pursuing their profit, they will follow your competitive advantages in the economy, in their choice of technology or industries. And the secret is to have a competitive market. Because if you have a competitive market, then the relative price of your factor's endowment will automatically reflect the relative scarcity or abundance your factors. So if you are labor abundant economy, if you have a free market, then the wage rate will relatively low and the capital will be relatively expensive. And with that kind of price signals, certainly entrepreneurs, for the purpose of their profit making, they will go into more labor-intensive industries, adopt more labor-intensive technologies, and vice versa. So you need to have a competitive market. But in this process, how come you also need to have a state there? Because industrial upgrading is not just buying in equipment. If you want to move from agrarian production to manufacturing sectors, the skill set will be different. And also, the economy of scale, the size of production will be different. If you're agrarian economy, you mainly produce for yourself. And you don't have so much surplus to sell to the market. If you sell to the market, you sell to people who you know. Under that kind of situation, you don't have to write a contract, and you don't need to have a good infrastructure because market is nearby. But if you move to the manufacturing sectors, you produce not for yourself anymore. The skill set will be different, and the market reach will be larger. You start to trade with people who you don't know. You need to write a contract. You need to have a contract enforcement. But in this kind of process, we know entrepreneur cannot internalize all those changes in skill set, in the infrastructure, in the legal system, and so on, unless you have the government to facilitate those kind of changes. Otherwise, even your endowment structure upgrade, your industry may not upgrade. So that is the reason why you need to have a facilitating state there. Okay. Then from the policy recommendation or implication from this new structural economics, you will find the recommendation from the Growth Commission report are consistent with the policy recommendation from this analysis. For example, if you follow your new structural economics policy implication, you need to follow your competitive advantage in each stage of development. And to that, you need to have you need to have a market economy. Also, you need to have a facilitation state to provide those kind of coordination and so on. And these are the recommendations of the status fact in the Growth Commission report. Status fact 4 and the status fact 5. And if you follow your comparative advantages, certainly you will be an open economy. You produce whatever you're good at and export that. And you import whatever you're not good at. And that certainly is an open economy. And then secondly, if you follow your competitive advantages, you will be competitive. So you are going to have less of homegrown prices. At the same time, you're going to have a much better external position. So when you encounter a crisis that we are encountering now, the government will be in a much better position to adopt counter-cyclical intervention. Under that kind of situation, certainly the economy is going to be more stable in its macroeconomy. And last one. As I argue, if you follow your comparative advantages, you can have the largest possible market share, both in domestic economy and in international economy. And you will be competitive so you can make the largest possible profit. So you have more to share, and return to investment will be largest. So you can have a higher saving rate and a high investment rate. So you can see this is also consistent with the starlight effect of the Growth Commission report. And certainly, this is also consistent with the finding of the East Asian miracle to be our orientation and also market-friendly government. And then from this new structural economics, we can also understand the value of the industrial policies or the government intervention in the past. Because as I argue, the old structuralism advised the country to develop industry which look very modern, very capital intensive, very technologically advanced. But those kind of industry went against the competitive advantage of low-income countries, which basically are agrarian. So under that kind of situation, because they went against their competitive advantages, the firms in the sectors in general are not viable. So the government needs to create all kind of distortion in order to protect them, subsidize them. As a result, even you could establish them, but you are going to create a lot of inefficiency due to the large government intervention, rent seeking, and so on. That was the reason why the old structuralism failed. And the new structural economics will advise. First, because follow competitive advantages is the key for successful economic development. You need to have a market as a necessary condition. You also need to have a government to facilitate the process. And historically, all the successful countries, no matter it's in Europe or it's in East Asia, the government all play those kind of functions. And they continue to play those kind of functions. Unfortunately, as I said, most developing countries, although the government had those kind of same intention to support the nation's modernization, to increase their income and so on, but they adopt wrong strategies, going the wrong route. Another issue is that how to help the government to do the right thing now. And what is the right thing they can do? According to the framework we have now, there are two approaches. One is promoted. Basically follow the Washington consensus to improve the business environment, to leveling the playing field. But this approach is insufficient. First is that it advised the developing country to adopt a whole set of reform. But the developing country government may not have the capacity to institute all those desirable reforms. That's one thing. And secondly, what desirable reform may very much depend on what kind of stage of your economy. The best institution in high-income country may not be the best institution in a developing country. But the business environment basically take the institution in a high-income country as the given, as a desired goal. And also, in the process, it only had level playing fields. But as I said, in economic development, the government needs to be proactive to provide necessary coordination and also sometimes to overcome some externality issue. And in this approach, it did not address those kind of issues. So very often we observe some countries, they improve their business environment according to this recommendation, but their economic development did not change this. The other approach that proposed by Daniel Roderick and Ricardo Hosman in Kennedy School at Harvard University, they are more pragmatic. They say that, well, since it was impossible for the government to introduce all desirable reforms, so you just remove the mining constraint. And once you remove the mining constraint, then economic growth can be unleashed. Well, I think this is one step forward. But from my point of view, it's not sufficient. The main reason is that the mining constraint for economic growth will be different for different industries. If you want to develop, say, a labor-intensive industries, or if you want to develop a capital-intensive industry, the infrastructure required, no matter it's in skill set or in the access to power, access to port facility will be different. That's one thing. It's endogenous to the industry. And secondly, according to the growth diagnostic, its diagnostics rely on the survey of the existing firm you have in the market now. But we know a lot of those firms were created by the older development strategies. And as I mentioned, older development strategies try to go against their competitive advantages. Under that kind of situation, even if you help those firms to remove the mining constraint, they are still in the wrong industries. And secondly, a lot of new industries were replaced in the past, so you may not have firm there. And although they are consistent with your competitive advantages, since they were not there, you cannot understand by survey about what are their mining constraints. And because of this deficit, I propose a new approach called the growth identification and facilitation. And for that, I have 6 steps. The first step is the most important one. That is how to identify the sectors, product, or industries which the economies has latent competitive advantages. It's your competitive advantages, but because of mining constraint, it has not become your competitive advantages. And how to identify those kind of industries? It's the key, it is the foundation for successful government intervention. And how to identify those kind of industries? Well, competitive advantage is depending on compare, right? So the first one approach I promote is that for the developing country, to look into the country currently, their per capita income is about 100% or 200% higher than your per capita income. And they have similar endowment structure as yours, abundant in natural resources or abundant in labor force. They're similar endowment structure. And they are growing dynamically in the past 20 years. And my argument is that if countries have similar endowment structure, they should have similar competitive advantages. And if the country, if their per capita income is twice or 3 times as high as yours, and they are growing dynamically in the past 20 years, their wage rate must be double, tripled. And the sector they have in the past 20 years, because of the increase in their wage rate, they are going to lose their competitive advantages. And if you enter into those kind of good sectors, you can use your low wages as your competitive edge and to turn that into a competitive sector. That is the first step. And I like to say, in effect, all the successful countries historically follow this approach. For example, in the 16th century, 17th century, at that time, Netherlands income was higher than Britain. And the British government introduced a lot of policy to support their domestic industrialization. And they were successful. How come they were successful? Because the per capita income in Britain at that time was already about 75% of the per capita income in Netherlands. And per capita income is a reflection of the stage of development or the endowment structure. Since their endowment structure are not so far away, but Britain was a little bit lower in income, which rate was lower. And so with the government facilitation, they can turn their industry to be as competitive or even more competitive than Netherlands industries. And similarly, in the 19th century, late 19th century, Germany, France, and the US also adopt industrial policy to support their domestic industrialization. At that time, they all target Britain, and they were successful. And the reason they were successful was that in the late 19th century, the per capita income in Germany, in France, in US was already about 60% to 75% of the UK's per capita income. And during the same periods, Russia, Poland, Hungary also adopt similar strategies, similar policies, target similar industries, but they failed. And the reason they failed was because at the time, the per capita income in Russia, in Poland, in Hungary, was only about 20–30% of the UK's per capita income. So that was too far away. And those kind of industries went against their competitive advantages, so they failed. And again, in the 1960s, Japan adopted industrial policy to support their industrialization. Japan was successful. And the reason, again, at that time, Japan targeted US. But per capita income in Japan in the 1960s was already about 40% of the US per capita income. So the stage of development was not too far away. We also understand Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, in the 1960s, 70s, also adopted industrial policy to support their industrialization. They were also successful. And the reason was because they target Japan instead of US. And their per capita income was about 30–40% of the Japanese per capita income. In the same period of time, other developing countries adopt industrial policy to support their industrialization. And most of them fail. The reason is because they target US directly. And their per capita income was only about 5% or 10% of the US per capita income, measured by purchasing power parity. So the first step is the most important one, and it is a summary of all successful countries' experiences. That's the first step. The second step that once you identify certain sectors as the sectors which you are likely to have latent competitive advantages, then you can come back to form to see whether you have some private firm already go into the production of those kind of products spontaneously. And if you have, then analyze what are the binding constraints for your domestic private firm to be as competitive as those reference countries' firm. Or what are the binding constraints for your other private firm to enter into the production of those kind of products. And help them to remove those kind of binding constraints. It can be the skill level. It can be access to finance. It can be the lack of infrastructure, including transportation or power or so on. That is the second step. And the third step is that, well, some of those kind of goods or sectors may be new to you. If that is the case, you can use your low wages as an incentive to encourage foreign direct investment to your country. Because if those sector has been developed in those countries for 20 years, their wage rate double, tripled. then the private firm in those countries will have the incentive to relocate their production to your country to tap into the potential low wages. Then you need to understand how come they have not come yet. What are the constraints for them to come? It can be infrastructure, it can be business environment, and so on. To remove those kind of constraints. And the fourth step is that in a modern time, because of rapid changes in technology, certainly there's always a new potential, which your reference country did not have 20 years ago. And if you have some kind of private firm already identified that, entering into that, and show the market potential domestically or internationally. And the government should understand that and to see what are the mining constraints for them to grow and help them to remove those mining constraints. And one famous example was IT industry in India. Those kind of IT services, call centers, programming, and so on, it's new industries. And a private firm in India identified the potential of that, entering into that starting in the 1980s. In 1980s, no reference country for India 20 years ago developed those kind of industry because it was totally new. At the beginning, they relied on satellite for telecommunication. The cost was very high. And after identifying the market potential, the Indian government improved the ground fixed line telecommunication, dramatically reduced the information cost, and that helped the IT industry in India to be such a successful case. So that's the fourth step. The fifth step, in many developing countries, infrastructure is a constraint for their industrial upgrading. And the business red tape is another constraint for their industrial upgrading. Certainly, it's desirable to improve the infrastructure for the whole nation, but that takes time, that takes resources. And for a developing country, you cannot wait. And so you can have a partial approach to improve the infrastructure and business environment in a specific area called industrial park or industrial zone, and encourage domestic firms to make investment or foreign direct investment into that kind of zone, and to make them as competitive as other countries. And this kind of approach also has the advantage of encourage business, industrial clustering, and further reduce the cost. But here I'd like to say, now industrial park become a very popular policy intervention. Some are successful, many of them are not successful. The reason why many of them are not successful was because when they develop industrial park, they aim too high. Because we know the business environment, the infrastructure requirement is endogenous to the type of industry that you try to develop. And if you wanted to aim certain sectors which you do not have competitive advantages, even you improve the infrastructure and so on, because they go against your competitive advantages. They are not viable unless the government continue to provide subsidy and protection. Otherwise, even you have the industrial park, they cannot be successful. So here is a warning, and also is a policy recommendation. The last one. The last one, economic development itself, no matter it's industrial upgrading or diversification, it's an innovation. Innovation for the first mover always encounter some kind of risk. It can be a failure, it can be a success. If it's a failure, certainly the first mover need to bear all the cost. If it's a success, and demonstrate that this sector is going to be our new competitive advantages, then the success will have a demonstration effect, attract a lot of entry, competition will come. And the first mover will not have the monopoly rate. So under this kind of situation, there's a symmetry between the potential loss and the potential gain. And no matter it's a failure or it's a success, it always provides useful information to other firms. So under this kind of situation, the government need to provide some incentive to encourage first mover. Because without first mover incentive, everyone will wait until other people to provide the demonstration. And if you do not have the first mover, you cannot have a dynamic economic growth. So how to do that? Well, you can provide some kind of tax incentive. First, the first mover can allow them to have a tax holiday for a few years. And in developing countries, access to finance is always a difficult issue, especially for the industry, they have comparative advantage. In general, it should be more labor intensive. In general, it's going to be small scale or medium size. And in general, now the developing country, you follow the old policy recommendation, in general, develop equity market and large bank. And so the small and medium-sized firm, which you have comparative advantage, in most cases cannot get financial services. So with this, the government should also arrange some kind of access to finance according to the industry the country wants to develop. In many developing countries, they also have a capital control. Currency is not convertible. But if you want to upgrade your industries, you need to import equipment. You need to import intermediate goods. Unless you have access to foreign exchanges, otherwise you cannot do upgrading. And so the government can also arrange certain kind of arrangement to facilitate the firm to get access to the foreign exchanges in order to import the necessary equipment and so on, according to their industrial policy. I think that if the government can do this, then the developing country can successfully to move away from agricultural resources-based economy, move to the manufacturing sectors, and gradually climb the industrial ladder to the service sectors and become a middle-income country and a high-income country. And this can also help the middle-income country to get out of the middle-income trap and continue their industrial upgrading and diversification to reach high-income status. And I think the joint hand of market and the state will also be important for the high-income country to continue of their industrial upgrading and also income growth. So let me stop here. Thank you.